I want to introduce our guest this evening, who is an old friend of mine, and he is a man who is an actor, a director, a producer, an author. In other words, he's a man of all seasons, a Renaissance man. It's my pleasure, if he's in the wings, to introduce Mr. Norman Lloyd. Are you there, Norman?
Hey, Billy! Billy! Billy. How great to see you. Lovely. How marvelous.
Would you like to sit here?
He wanted me to sit there.
All right, sit there.
I'm obeying instructions.
All right, so am I. All right. So I just...
Hello!
So I just told them all about me being a last-minute replacement for Ed, who's under the weather, and there was a sigh of disappointment. But I'm gonna, I'm gonna forge ahead. And since I just got this assignment this morning, I immediately called the foundation, and I said, "Would you please give me Norman's, his rundown of all the things that he's done, his resume." I have a resume. It runs like a page and a half or something like that. They sent me this thing. And, I had a few chores to do during the day, so I really didn't get to it till late in the afternoon. And then well, to be perfectly honest, I didn't get through it all. I mean, his resume runs maybe 20 pages. I mean, Norman, I was going to ask how you got started in show business, but then I realized that perhaps show business didn't exist when you got started. I mean, when you think about it, there was no television. There were a few talkies, but mostly silent films, and radio was in its infancy. Was Edmund Booth around, or?
He supported me in a production of
I think
Macbeth,
that you must have been on the scene when the play.
But I will tell you, Billy, in all honesty, about Booth.
Really?
In one of the things on there, it will list that I was on the WPA, the Federal Theater.
Yes.
On the living newspaper. And, this was 1936. And there were a lot of...
Depression.
The Depression? The Depression. Oh. And there were a lot of elderly actors on the project.
Yes.
And two of the fellows on the living newspaper, one of whom was Fuller Mellish, who had acted with Henry Irving, and was brought over.
I was kidding. That's the truth.
So he was in it, and he was brought to this country by Richard Mansfield.
Oh, God.
Do these names mean anything? Now, there was a fellow named Wilfred Clark. And he was Edwin Booth's nephew.
Oh, my God.
And he was in his 80s. And one day he was telling me the story, if I may tell the story to them.
Was it at the Players Club?
No, backstage.
Okay.
Or something. And he was telling me the story of the first time he went on with his uncle, Edwin Booth.
Oh, God.
And it was some play in verse, and he was scared to death.
Oh.
And finally, his entrance came, he went out, he had the line to speak, which was something like, "The onus is on Venus." And he became panicked as he stared at his great uncle. And he said, "Well, the penis is on Venus. The penis is on Venus." That was his first line he ever spoke with Edwin Booth.
You know, no matter what I say, it's a lead into a wonderful story from this man. He's a force of nature. He really is. As I say, I couldn't get through all of this. I mean, look at these things. I mean, that he's done. It's incredible. Well, we only have 2 hours. This is just some of the roles he's played. It goes on and on. But what I did want to ask you, particularly Norman, you know, Norman and I spent 6 years together on a show called St. Elsewhere. So, you know,
And may I say, I consider that show and working with Billy and Ed Flanders the equal of any experience I had either in the theater or television or radio or anything.
Goodness. Well, thank you, Norman. That's wonderful to hear. You know, I've been really curious about some of these things. First of all, I think everybody here would like to know about your experiences, for instance, in the Mercury Theater with Hitchcock and Orson Welles and all of that. And I know before that, I have to tell you, before that, Norman started really with a very famous actress, Eva Le Gallienne, in her Civic Theater in New York. And during our 6 years in St. Elsewhere, Miss Le Gallienne came and played a starring role in one of our episodes, and I happened to be involved with that episode. And so I was there at the makeup table when Miss Le Gallienne was being made up. And Norman, who I don't even think had to be there that day, came in to his dear friend with a handful of flowers to present to her and welcome her on the show. And I thought that was pretty cool of you.
Thank you.
At any rate,
She said to me, "Where is your red hair?" Can't win.
but what about those days? At the Civic and the Mercury? Is there anything you'd like to share with this audience?
Well, one doesn't want to sound like one of those old actors who said, you know,
But there's no getting around it.
No, there isn't, because I recently played a part of a 90-year-old blind literature professor in a film. And when I am 89 and a half, and when it was presented to me, I said, well, I'm not 90, but I could stretch 6 months.
With a little makeup.
Billy knew the answer. So when you say elderly actors, I think of other actors, you know.
Exactly.
But these were wonderful days in the theater in New York. One thinks back on the long years back, and it was, as Billy said, the Depression. But you know, there was something about that time where we all had, to use a very dangerous word, hope. And we all thought it's got to be better and we can do anything. And you know, we damn near did everything you wanted to do in the theater in those days. And you didn't need, we started the Mercury on $6,000. Now I know that money is different today and it's rates and all that kind of thing, but it was very little money. And I think most of it went for Orson's meals. God could he eat. And he would always eat during rehearsal and not let the company break for any food. It was so exciting, that period. Orson was truly at the top of his game at that time. And he was just brilliant. I mean, he was a director. You see, he was the first director, I believe, in the American theater to bring together everything. That is to say, we had wonderful guys who could stage plays, like George S. Kaufman, or George M. Cohan, or Philip Muller at the Guild. They could all stage plays very well. But what Orson did, when you went into the theater, you suddenly were surrounded. Not only the staging, the acting, the lights, the sound, all sorts of things going on at the same time. He brought together, in a production sense, in a totality, he was the first American producer to really do that. And so we participated in that. And he was just wonderful. Great energy, very easy to work with. Constantly screaming at John Houseman, and John Houseman screaming at him. So that kind of screaming, you know, that you don't hear after a while. They're just screaming at each other, but you don't hear it. You read the new sports pages or something. And he was very easy with the actors. Fantastic, as I've indicated, in staging. And as he once said to me, you know, I may not be the greatest director with working out a performance with an actor, but if an actor brings a performance to me, I know how to stage it. And that is very true. So they were exciting days, and not only that, it hit New York, that production of Julius Caesar. He had had success immediately before on the Federal Theater with Faust and Faustus and Horse Eats Hat, and then the famous Cradle Will Rock, which you all know that story. But the thing is that he really hit New York with Julius Caesar, which was modern dress. Mussolini was still in power. So he set it in Rome in the Italian fascist uniforms. Mark Blitzstein, who did the music for the show, took the fascist anthem, the Giovinezza, and adapted it to the show. And so it worked like a political melodrama that had been written the night before. You felt that Shakespeare was around and was just writing the stuff for you that next day. It had that immediacy, extraordinary. And that was his really big breakthrough for the first time. And so that was wonderful working with Orson. Mm-hmm. And
then you went on with Hitchcock for a long time.
Yeah. Well, the Hitchcock thing was the films, yeah. Yes. It's interesting. In 1939, Orson brought us all out to do a picture, The Heart of Darkness. And the studio, RKO, said, no, we don't want to do it. There was a script. They didn't want to do it. So Orson asked us to stay while he tried to put together another deal. The deal he wanted put together was a book called The Smiler with a Knife by Nicholas Blake, which was a pseudonym for C. Day Lewis, the poet, who was the father of the actor Daniel Day-Lewis.
Daniel Day-Lewis?
Yeah.
Really? Mm-hmm.
His father was the poet C. Day Lewis, and wrote this. But Orson couldn't put a deal together with that book. And my wife and I went back to New York. So I was not considered for Citizen Kane, but at the same time, I was fortunate enough to meet with Hitchcock and came out to do Saboteur. Yes. And with Hitchcock, what can you say? I mean, he was the most wonderful man. One was so lucky to be with him. His humor was so constant, and it had such strange forms. The first day I went on the set, which I wasn't shooting, I was just visiting, and he came over to me. He approached me and rolled the belly out. He said, "You sent for me?" I turned 8 different colors. I said, "No, Mr. Hitchcock, I didn't send for you." He did those things for you. He constantly was doing that kind of thing, keeping everybody a little off balance. But he was He was fun. You had a sense that this was a world figure. This was not some guy directing, coming off the streets. This was there was about him a cosmopolitanism. And and then you began to see the way he did things, the simplicity and yet the rightness. And he had a phrase that he used called camera logic. And I once asked him, I said, what do you mean by that, Hitch? And he said, the camera should be exactly where it has to be to tell the story. So simple, so difficult to do. He was interesting with actors. He said, I hire professionals. I expect them to know what to do. So after a while, that's it, and that was it.
How about that?
But what he would do is he would put you in a way, place you, so that you showed off to your best advantage. That is to say, if he had a scene in mind, he would just tell you where to go, where to look. Look off to the right. For example, I have been complimented over the years for the scene in Saboteur where I'm in a taxi and I look over and see the Normandy has capsized over on its side, which actually happened, as those of you may remember. The Normandy, which at that time was the largest liner in the world, had been converted into, or was going to be converted into a troop ship, yeah. And it was in the pier on the west side there, off the West Side Highway. And we were shooting when news came in that it had caught on fire and had started to capsize, which it eventually did onto its side. Hitchcock immediately, Universal had a newsreel branch, and immediately ordered footage shot of that and of what they call plates. Ordered a mock-up of a cab and ordered plates, that is, camera shooting straight back, camera shooting three-quarter angles on either side of the West Side Highway, which went along past those piers, as we remember, Billy. And he ordered those plates, they came in the next day, and then he ordered a mock-up of the cab. So now he said to me, you get in the cab, and on a cue, I'll tell you to look off to your right, which I did. So I got in the cab, I'm going along. Now the plates will show that I'm riding on the West Side Highway, and I got my cue, and I looked, and then I came back. Now, when that film was put together with the ship on its side, everyone said, that was the most wonderful look. What a piece of acting. I mean, what you conveyed in that look, that you had really burned that boat. Of course, I never saw the boat. Not till I saw the movie. So that has to do with what Hitch, you know, he had a wonderful phrase, you do a scene, and he'd say, cut it, that's all you need, to the cameraman. He
had it all in his mind.
He had it in his mind. He hardly ever looked in the camera. We had a great cameraman on that picture named Joe Valentine. And in those days, the equipment was much simpler than it is today. Today you have wonderful things in the cranes and the reflex lenses and the reflex cameras and the zooms and the Steadicam and the crab dolly. Now, there was none of that then, none. And they had old, what they call flat lenses. They didn't have the vitality of the lenses of today. Joe Valentine laid out a shot. In order to lay out a shot, in those days, as I said, there was no crab dolly, so he had to lay track, which was like putting down two rails for trains. And now on this, he put the camera on it, and he had this whole shot laid out. Hitch laid out this shot. finally he had it laid out, and he said to the assistant, sent for Mr. Hitchcock, and Hitch came on. He said, Hitch, would you like to see the shot? And he said, oh, no, dear boy. I've looked in a camera before. Never looked in the camera. He would come out of his dressing room where he usually was reading either the Wall Street Journal or the London Times. I never saw him reading the script. And he'd come out, and he'd say to the cameraman, what have you got on? I'd say, a 40 lens. Where are you cutting him? He said, at the knees. He said, let's shoot it. So he had that, you had a sense of a master when he walked on, and he was always dressed, you know, in the black suit, the white shirt, and the black tie. So he either looked like an enormously wealthy banker or an undertaker. It depended on how you felt. Now, actors adored him, but not every actor. He did have difficulty with Paul Newman.
Oh, really?
Because Paul is rather method, you know.
Yes.
And at one moment, he was having a difficult time with Hitch, and at one moment, he said to Hitch on a piece of staging, he said, why do I sit in the chair at that point? And Hitch said, to put your ass in the seat of the chair. He did not believe in confrontation. But he was wonderful. And I must tell you just one more thing about him.
Absolutely. Yeah.
He made a picture over at Metro, North by Northwest.
Oh, yeah.
Wonderful picture. Cary Grant was the star. This was the fourth picture that Grant did with him. They had gotten on wonderfully well, but for some reason, and I think I know what the reason was, you know, Hitch used to make pictures for $2 million. None of these $100 million budgets. And even though, let's say, the money has doubled or tripled now, but still. But at Metro, he suddenly went up to $4 million, and Metro began to get very nervous and get after him, and of course, water off the duck's back, you know. And somehow, there was an abrasive thing that happened between him and Grant. Although, as I say, he never believed in discussing, confrontation, nothing. But it was not as relaxed as ever. Picture opens, great notices, fabulous notices for this picture. And it's held up very well over the years. I was sitting having lunch with Hitchcock in the Universal Commissary. The old one, remember, it was a circle, it was like the turret of a ship. And Grant walks into the commissary. And the notices have just come out, and they're great. And he walks over to the table. And with his commissary filled, Grant kneels, takes Hitch's hand,
To Hitch.
and says, "You are the king." And what more could you ask? But that was Hitch. I mean, one could go on forever with him. He was personally wonderful to me, and put me on as a producer on his television show, which I did for 8 years, and that was a great job because I looked for the good parts and play them myself.
Is that why you never called me?
Oh, Billy, my apologies.
You know, something else. You told me this story about Chaplin and his boat, and how you all had to get on the boat, probably coming up to Santa Barbara or something. But he dove off that boat, and you were expected to dive after him in the ice-cold water. He was quite a man, wasn't he?
I didn't dive in, though.
No, he didn't, no.
No, but
he did.
He did. Oh, well, he had a boat that Charlie Chaplin had this boat called the Panacea. It was from the 1930s. It was like what they used to call a launch, and mahogany, and it sat upright in the water, nothing streamlined about it. And he had put 2 great diesel engines in it, had taken them out of this whole thing. And he had a cook and a pilot and so forth and so on. And my wife and I were fortunate enough to be invited out with Charlie and Una on this boat. Where he would be going would be from San Pedro over to White's Landing in Catalina.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, what Charlie loved to do in this boat was he'd love to stand on the front. What is it? The bow.
The bow. Yes. Yes.
And he would
sort of like
sing.
Titanic, the kid on the Titanic.
The kid on the Titanic. It's like the prow of the ship. He'd be singing opera as the thing was going across all over. And incidentally, from an acting point of view, when we were crossing, he said, you know, when we were making 1 and 2 reelers, we had to do our own stunts. And he said, we'd cross over here and we'd dive off and come up under the other side for the shot. And they'd have to do that themselves. He just said this in passing as this thing was going along.
Oh my God.
And we got over the other side, and then we had a little supper and coffee. But then, what Billy's referring to is the thing I told him. I said, in the morning, Charlie said, no breakfast until everyone dives in. No breakfast. Well, this was the last thing I wanted to do. Una, his wife, was a wonderful swimmer. She had been raised in Bermuda. Her father was Eugene O'Neill, as you know, the playwright. So O'Neill had been down there and was still married to Una's mother. And she was a great swimmer. But Charlie, he would dive in and said, come on, Norman, come on now. But I resisted. I really was a poor guest. So, but he loved that. He loved singing on the ship and sailing across. He was a genius. He was extraordinary. Again, you got a sense of a world figure. This is not just a guy. And he was a world figure. The world, every Chaplin, anything he did resounded through the world, didn't it? And but he had wonderful human qualities. For example, he had a butler named Watson. Now, Watson was the butler. You know, the butler did it. Mm-hmm. The butler did it. Mm-hmm. That was Watson. Had wooden teeth.
Oh, really?
Oh, he was Watson, yes. He was a snob. He felt Charlie was inferior because Lady Mendel, who was a woman in Beverly, gave better parties, so he let her. Now, what Charlie loved in the morning was warm grapefruit. And he'd have that brought into him. And Watson would bring this grapefruit and put it down. And Charlie would wait for Watson to leave, and then he'd quickly eat the loosened pieces. And what he loved about the warm grapefruit was he'd take the grapefruit and he'd go, and then he'd put it down, and he'd reshape it. You see?
Like a scene.
Like that's absolutely a scene. Watson would re-enter to take up the used grape. There's something amiss here. But he could never figure it out. Charlie delighted in that. He delighted in fooling Watson about the grapefruit. But he had these human touches, you know.
That's lovely.
I remember down on the tennis court, he was a tennis addict, as Billy and I are. And so I used to play a lot of tennis with him. I remember one day, there was the court and there was a tennis house right next to it where the guests would sit, but it was raised up. And you looked down on it. And I was waiting on the court for him. He came into the tennis house and he looked down and he saw a butterfly on the cord. And it was struggling. And he just couldn't stand. He said, Norman, please take it and put it in the bushes somewhere. And he couldn't, he wouldn't go on the cord until that butterfly was removed. It was very interesting. It's almost like the tramp character, you know.
Was he a good player?
Pretty good.
Pretty good. Not as good as you.
Well, I tell you, he was good, but he had an ego problem. He wouldn't wear his glasses when he played. So he couldn't get near the net because the ball would be on him too fast. So he had to stay on the baseline and hit the ball. But he loved the game. He was, when I'd come up there about 3 o'clock in the winter or about 4:30 in the summer, he'd already be in his tennis clothes with the can of balls, and he couldn't wait to drop the pencil on the script that he was working on. He just loved throwing down the pencil and going out on the court. Mm-hmm. He was a totally unique man. And there was a director in town who was a dear friend of mine, Bob Aldrich, Robert Aldrich. You've all seen his pictures. And Bob Aldrich said to me, Bob and I had done quite a bit of work together, and when he heard that Charlie was going to do Limelight, he said to me, you know, I know that's going to be the last picture he does in America. I've got to get on my picture. In those days, Bob was an assistant director and very tough. He was like a top sergeant. As luck would have it, Charlie said to me one day while he was still preparing the picture, he said, you know, the costs have gone up very much. And he financed his own pictures because he would not what they would call cross-collateralize. He wouldn't say, you can have the rights to my other pictures if this picture doesn't make money. No, he never gave up the rights to his pictures. And when he died, as a result, he left this enormous fortune to his family, his 8 children. And Bob said, I've got to get on this picture as assistant director. Now, as luck would have it, Charlie said, this is going to be very expensive. I need someone who can drive this through. I said, Charlie, I know the guy. It just dropped right from heaven. I told him about Bob, and he told his guy to hire Bob, and he hired Bob. Now, Bob Aldrich hadn't directed yet, and he was desperate to direct. But as a really thorough assistant director, he couldn't quite understand the way Chaplin directed. Because in the first place, Charlie would say to the cameraman, I heard this. Carl Struess was the cameraman. I heard him say to Charlie, what do you want me to do in this scene? And Charlie said, get me in the crosshairs and just follow me. Beautiful.
Oh, that's lovely.
And he said, the cutter was not allowed to touch anything until he came into the cutting room. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, every single thing he did in front of the camera was printed. Because he would take a gesture from one, a movement from another, a look or whatever. From 5, 6, 7, 8 takes, he would take just pieces of all and put the scene together. But the story about Bob is interesting because he was driving Bob crazy because Charlie would come in the morning and scratch. You know, nowadays fellas come in and they've got it all written out and said, now there's scene 1 and then we shoot cut. All right, we go over here, there's scene 2, and it's television. But Charlie would sort of scratch his ass, you see. He'd say, what I do here? You know. Bob Aldrich was violating every precept he had about making pictures, but he watched him. And finally, Charlie got, and the other thing, Bob had a mannerism. He'd stand in back of Charlie. If Charlie was directing, he'd stand in back of Charlie, and Aldrich had this mannerism. Like standing behind Charlie.
Let's get on with it.
Yeah. And did I tell you this? No. Charlie didn't say anything. Finally, one day, after a week or two of this, Charlie comes in at 9 o'clock when we should have started shooting. We used to shoot in his studio, you know, on La Brea. You all know where that is. And he's wearing a top coat that he must have come over in on the 1914. It's the oldest looking top coat. He's got this old hat on and these thick glasses that he used to wear at that point in his life. He was just an old man like that. He looks around, sees Aldrich. He says, "What are we waiting for?" Aldrich says, "Well, you, Mr. Chaplin, you're in the first shot." He said, "Oh, what is that shot?" And Aldrich says, "Scene 23. Charlie said, "Don't give me numbers. What's the scene about?" He said, "Oh, well, it's where you come in and go into your dressing room." He says, "Oh, well, I don't feel like doing that scene." Aldrich began to pale because this means you're throwing out his schedule. What else do you have? He says, "Well, the follow-up scene, scene 24. He said, "I told you I don't want numbers. What's the scene about?" This was one of the most beautiful things ever. He said, "Oh, well, that's where Buster Keaton comes into the dressing room." And Dumas says, "Ah, yes. Well, I don't feel like doing that either." "What else have you got?" Went through the whole morning schedule, but now he was telling Charlie what the scenes were about. He wasn't saying numbers. And he said, "Well, I don't feel like doing any acting this morning. Find me something else to do." Bob said, "Yes, sir." He walked away, and as he walked away, he passed me. He said, "Guy doesn't know anything about directing, anything. Greatest actor in the world, doesn't know anything about directing." And Charlie had him find all the scenes. But Bob Aldrich, never again did he do this.
Yeah.
Never again.
Yeah, that's marvelous.
And that's what Charlie was after all the time. He settled him in.
Norman, one other thing I'd like to go, I think the audience here would be interested. You were really around before the Screen Actors Guild took place. And I think they'd like to hear a little bit about what it was like before this union helped actors. And you were there.
I think when I joined in '39, I think there was the union already.
Oh, yeah, there was.
In '37. But what Billy's driving at is a very important thing. And I really should relate it. It involves Screen Actors Guild. It involves actors' equity. Before equity and the Screen Actors Guild came along, I talked to you before about Fuller Mellish, who acted with Sir Henry Irving. In the history of acting, Henry Irving was one of the great actors, and Mellish was in his company. Mansfield, one of the greatest American actors, brought him over to play Jacques. He was the greatest Jacques, in As You Like It, of his time. The reason I tell you this is that when I met up with Fuller Mellish and all those other elderly actors who had been with Ziegfeld and with Booth and so on, there was no Social Security. There was no unemployment insurance. There was nothing. There was no safety net for the actor. Nothing. So that when Fuller Mellish died, and I was asked by one of the executives of the Living Newspaper to go over to his apartment, which was a room over near 9th Avenue in New York. In those days, it wasn't so fancy. But 9th Avenue, he was in a rooming house with his widow sitting there with him, lying dead. She didn't have any money to do it. She had nowhere to appeal, nothing to appeal to. So before there were Screen Actors Guild and Equity and Social Security and unemployment insurance, we can thank Roosevelt for all that. There was no safety net for the actors. It was just a terrible thing. There was no welfare. An actor was helpless. And so one always felt very strongly about the union. And of course today it's primary. And benefits, forget the benefits, they hadn't even dreamed of them then. And I think it was only until 1960 that we got benefits in the Screen Actors Guild. But those were things that were just dreams. And the plight of the actor was a terrifying one. And when one looks back and realizes that you managed to float despite that, it's scary. It's scary to think that one went into a profession that was so dangerous economically. We had our battles. When we were on the WPA, there was a constant battle to keep the WPA going, to keep the Federal Theater going. There was always an attempt to close it down. The Cradle Will Rock, you probably all know the story of that, how the government said the opening night you can't go on, and the entire audience at the Maxine Elliott Theater on 39th Street followed the cast up Broadway, the entire audience to 59th Street, where Orson and Houseman had obtained a theater. The old Jolson Theater became the Venice. And the audience went into that theater. Meanwhile, news had reached the Equity executives that the actors had gone up there to do this, although the government said you can't do this play. So the actors were told they were prohibited from getting up on stage. So they all sat in a row in the audience. And Orson and Houseman had found a piano somewhere and put it up on the stage, and Blitzstein sat on the stage. And as he started to play and the cues came in, the actors stood up in the audience, and that's where they did the show. The entire audience, which had followed them all the way up Broadway. Now, this, in response to Billy's question, you say, well, what does that have to do with the union? Well, we had our problems with the union, too. They were trying to follow the instructions that the government had given them. But the actors went ahead, and then Orson took that production and said, my goodness, he had a whole scenic plan. He had a lot of scenery when he was going to do it on WPA, and he realized he didn't need any of it. He threw it all out so that when we did it at the Mercury, he did it on a bare stage. And he learned that that was the right way to do the show that night when the actors stood up in the audience and did the show.
Oh, that's a marvelous story.
But I don't know if I made the point. There was nothing before there were unions. And now I think you know what you have. Pension. No one ever heard of such a thing, that actors could have pensions.
I have some questions here from people in the audience for you, Norman. And I'm trying to pick out. They wanted, this question from Frank Ross is not so much a question, it's, he wants to know about your production of Awake and Sing with Walter Matthau. Do you have any thoughts about that? Do you remember it?
Yes.
Well, I mean, with all the stuff you've done.
There it is. You remind me of the great story of, of Henry Irving. Someone came up to him and said, "Oh, Sir Henry, I saw your Hamlet in Manchester. It was magnificent." He said, "Hamlet, Manchester, yeah. Yes, my wife played the Queen. The woman I was living with at the time played Ophelia." What a cast! So he had to reach back, you see. Well, when you say Walter Matthau,
Yeah.
you speak one of the most beautiful guys I've ever known in my life. I really love Walter. Walter's an evening in himself. He was unique, and you knew him well.
Yes.
Do you ever work with him?
No, but I know him because his son and my son went to school together, so I really got to know Walter.
But Walter, I'll tell you an interesting thing, though. I asked him to be in Reminiscing to play Mo. And God, he was wonderful, wonderful. But before he said yes, we were driving to the racetrack. In those days, he used to bet on horses. He just limited it after a while to baseball games, basketball games, and...
He was an addict.
oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
The underworld in this country used to talk about the actor, and they meant Walter.
Yeah. He owed them a lot of money.
He's the only man I ever knew who bet on spring training baseball games. Now you have got to be crazy to do that. And he never lost his roots. But he came from the Lower East Side, New York, and his stories of those days are so beautiful, so moving. He came from such terrible poverty, such awful poverty, but he was great. Now, on Reminiscing, I was doing it for the Hollywood Television Theater, which was part of PBS. We did it here at KCET. And in this case, I was directing it. And so now we're driving to the racetrack. And I asked him if he wouldn't be in it. There's a long silence as he continues driving. He says, "Yes, I'll do it. It'll be good to do some real acting again." And that's how he felt
Yes.
about
Sure.
what he was doing and
right.
going back into a real play.
Right.
Yeah. And so that you realize there was always that, no matter how much he fooled around and laughed and gestured and so forth, he
Always a
had
serious
great
actor.
integrity.
Yes.
Great
Serious-
integrity.
Serious actor.
He was funny. I mean, he had his ways. He had a thing of going on the set on the first day and finding the leading lady, and when her back was turned, he would grab one of her buttocks as a greeting. And on his last picture, which was before he finished, I know this isn't politically correct, but it's awfully human. And on his last picture, he walks on, and there's Diane Keaton. And he goes over, and he does his usual thing. He grabs one of her buttocks, and she says, "Please, I'm the director." I find that wonderful.
Not the ingenue.
Not the opposite.
Funny.
But one could go on for weeks about Walter because you couldn't believe this guy. I mean, and his stories of the Lower East Side. But I'll just tell you one quick thing that actually happened with him, and then we'll move on because, well, an acting story. And Walter started in the Yiddish Theater. And he started in by being a candy butcher, as you all know what that is. And then finally worked his way up on the stage with Leo Fuchs in a Leo Fuchs production on the Lower East Side, on Houston Street. And he, I think his first line was "Oi" or something like that. And then he finally got a job uptown in a rather fancy production, Rex Harrison and Anne of 1,000 Days. Blank verse by Maxwell Anderson, Joyce Redman, I think. And he was a spear carrier, but he was understudying an old actor named Harry Irvine. And the guy became ill. Harry Irvine became ill, and Walter went on. And in those days, his speech was still very Lower East Side. It always had that cast to it anyway. But in those days, it was kind of extremely so. And they rehearsed Walter in the afternoon, but without Rex Harrison. Now comes the evening performance, and they go on, and now he's due to come on. He comes on, and the scene progresses, comes his cue. And he has this thing with Harrison. And he goes, the point of the thing is that if you go over here, this is a British production, Anne of 1,000 Days, and if you go down there, then you come up here, and then you go down there, and then you go there. Harrison looks at him, turns his back to the audience and goes, oh, shit. Because you know Rex Harrison, who's so well, you know. That's his actor story. The other human story with him is, he was walking down his alley, his driveway in Pacific Palisades, and along comes an Orthodox Jewish fellow of the Chabad, who's definitive. He has the black hat, the bushy hair, the beard, the payas, the tzitzis, black suit, just it. He sees Walter. He said, excuse me, are you Jewish? Walter says, yeah. Are you? You know, beautiful. So quick, you know. You could go on forever about that guy.
God.
He was all of the human race in one. I mean, I loved him. We had marvelous times together.
Here's a question from Matt Richards. This is a loaded question, actually. He says, I know that many successful actors become activists, but are there obstacles to an activist becoming a successful actor?
No, there aren't. You see, as Billy says, I go back to the beginning of time. And I must tell you, in the 30s, we were all activists. We were wild to save the world. The Depression, and we had to constantly organize, fight for jobs. There was the threat of Hitler. Our great cause at that time was Loyalist Spain. We were active about everything. And I think it was the most exciting and flourishing era of the American theater up to and including today. It was a time of such excitement in the theater. And the pictures were very interesting. Look at the pictures, and eventually, remember what Warner Brothers had there? They had all those pictures that had to do with what was going on the streets of America. I mean, I know you had the pretty things over there at Metro and all that, but you had some very tough pictures coming out in those times. And the actors who came to pictures from that theater brought a great reality to pictures. I don't have to list them. I know they're all in all your minds. But yes, activism in those, it wasn't called activism, to say we got organize, you know. And there were shows that were constantly dealing with the social problems of the day. And you felt as an actor that you were making a contribution to the illumination and the progress of the world. It was very exciting. It was thrilling. I mean, even we were talking about Austen and Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was done as a political play. And of course, a man like George Bernard Shaw will tell you that you have to be political as an artist. There is no elitist fantasy that you can play out and relate still to an audience. Chaplin was a political artist. Not only personally did they get him because they felt that he was too leftist, although my favorite story about that is he was a great friend of old Samuel Goldwyn. And they went to Samuel Goldwyn, they being the FBI, and said, "Is it true that Chaplin is a communist?" He said, "Charlie, a communist? He's the only true capitalist I know." It's a true story. And Charlie, you see, he was indebted to Charlie because old Sam had made several false starts in the business as a producer. That's how it ended up as Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, but he wasn't part of the Goldwyn after its early years. Right. He was out. Mm-hmm. Mayer got him out. They all got him out. Mm-hmm. But he would try this and try that. Finally, he had his last chance. He was shooting a picture with Vilma Banky and Rod LaRocque, I think it was. But it was the first appearance of Gary Cooper. It was Gary Cooper's first picture. I think it was 1923 or something. And in the middle of shooting, he ran out of money. And he needed $150,000 the next morning. He went to Charlie. Went to Charlie's house. Told him the problem. Charlie gave him $150,000 right there. Saved it. It was Goldwyn's first hit, and he was on his way. So Goldwyn always had this great respect and friendship for Charlie. So he knew very well what Charlie's thinking was. And Charlie was just, as Charlie once said, "I am not a warmonger. I am a peacemonger," and left it at that. And they couldn't shut him up. He would say that. Although during World War I, you know, he and Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford went out and raised millions of dollars on bonds. Mm-hmm. And they cut him off in the middle of the ocean when he went over. Said he couldn't get back unless he passed a moral turpitude test.
Incredible.
So he said, "I will never come back and I will never make another picture in America." And he never did. Limelight was the last picture. So when you ask about activism, it's a question of what is activism? Mm-hmm. Charlie would just state what he thought. Mm-hmm. He had a right to think. But I tell you, the 30s were so exciting, and for movies too. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And that's when, of course, you know, in the 30s, you had the great double features. And on 42nd Street, those theaters where you could go in before 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock something for some theaters a dime, others 25 cents. And they were known, all those theaters up along 42nd Street, which used to be legitimate houses, were no longer, they were known as itch joints, which tells you what they were. But it was during the Depression that motion pictures became the art of the people. Mm-hmm. It was during that period when people, particularly unemployment, you had a dime, you had a quarter, if you'd go in and sit there and look at double features. That was when they really sailed. You look at an MGM picture with all that lushness and richness and say, well, maybe. Let's continue. So, yes, I believe the answer to that is you can be. No ivory towers.
No.
There are no ivory towers.
And certainly not like today. I told you he was a force, didn't I? Tremendous. Listen, here's an interesting thing, Norman. There's a gentleman out front by the name of Travis McCulley, and he says, I was your prop man on several Hollywood TV theaters and thoroughly enjoyed working with you and really admired the way you handled KCET management. What does that mean?
Got money to get productions every time.
Is that it?
Yeah. We'd have to go to the management and say, we need a few dollars to do the show.
Yeah.
And
They didn't interfere with you at all.
no, they were wonderful. They were absolutely wonderful. That was a different management from the one that's there now. We were very lucky about one thing. When we had the KCET thing and the Hollywood Television Theater, we were subsidized by the Ford Foundation. So they would go to the Ford Foundation, who would give them the money. But at a certain point, the Ford Foundation pulled back from all of that. And that was the end of that.
Yeah.
But they were very generous up until then.
And there were some wonderful productions, too, as I recall.
One about Paul Muni.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was like the life of Paul Mooney? Or how was that?
It was called Actor. It was by Lawrence and Lee.
Yes.
And
I just had an occasion to read, again, Inherit the Wind.
Yeah.
What a wonderful play that was, that he starred in.
Yeah. And Jerry Lawrence had done a book about Paul Muni called Actor.
Aha.
And so I thought it'd be a good idea to turn it into a musical.
Yeah.
Particularly the early part, which dealt with Muni's family coming to America.
Yes.
And, you know, and their difficulty in getting on here was
Yes.
very difficult. But, you know, I think back, if we were to run this today, we did something at the beginning of it that I'm very happy we did. We ran clips of Muni's pictures at the beginning of this thing to let the audience know who he was. Because even then, in the 70s, we thought they'd forgotten who Paul Muni was. And they wouldn't know whom we were talking about. So we ran about 8 or 9 minutes of Good Earth, the one where he said, I steal. What was it called? The end when he looks in the camera and says, I steal. What was it called?
Fugitive from a Chain Gang.
Yes. And about 3 or 4 others. And
Did he do Pastor?
Hmm?
Did he do Pastor? No.
no, he did. No, Pastor was Robinson.
Yeah, right.
No, Robinson was Ehrlich. He was Ehrlich, the magic bullet.
Right.
He did Anatole France. No, Anatole France was Karnofsky. I think you're right, Billy. I think you're right.
I
It was
thought maybe he
Pasteur.
did.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Louis Pasteur. Yeah. Marvelous. Marvelous. I'm looking at some of these. You've covered some of these questions about, well, what was the major difference in directing styles between Chaplin and Hitchcock, if any?
There was enormous,
yeah.
enormous. That is to say, Hitch just told you, well, in this scene, you go over and you sit down there and go there, we'll shoot it. But you do all the time, you see what was going on. Charlie, on Limelight, which was my experience with him, this may sound awful, but I don't mean it as such. With Nigel Bruce and myself, he was the soul of decorum. Darling, do this scene. Oh, that's very good. We do it. Do it over again, faster, slower, whatever. With Sidney, his son, and Claire Bloom, whose first picture it was, he was hell on wheels.
Really?
I don't know how they lived through it. And it was impossible. He would sit under the camera and play both parts, go back and forth, you know. But they steeled themselves and they took it, and it worked. I mean, it did work, but I would not. He directed by showing.
Yeah.
Now, in the theater, I had a director like that, Mark Connolly. Mark Connolly was bald, and he would direct with his hat on for the men. If he was the man, he would read the line with his hat on. Then he'd take his hat off and do the woman. He'd go back and forth out of that, and giving you readings all the time.
Oh, God.
You have to be patient.
What was that with Mark Connolly?
Everywhere I roam.
Everywhere I roam.
It was about Johnny Appleseed with Dean Jagger, who was a lovely actor.
Oh,
Beautiful
wasn't he?
actor,
Wasn't he? God.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Here's a question. Tell us what it was like to work with Otto Kruger, Bob Cummings, Priscilla Lane on Saboteur. You talked a little bit about Saboteur, but do you have any thoughts about Mr. Kruger or Mr. Cummings or Miss Lane?
Well, Bob
Quite a class.
Yeah, I was very good. Bob Cummings was a wonderful guy. The best way to describe Bob Cummings is at his funeral.
Oh.
You can see I've worked with Hitchcock. But at his funeral, at the service in the little chapel over at Forest Lawn, the priest officiated, and then Milton Berle got up to speak.
At
The first thing at the funeral.
Oh, dear.
And the first thing he did was say to the priest, "You run a nice service here, Rabbi Magnan." This has to do with Bob. So having gotten his first laugh, he was warm up. And this is the way he opened. He said, "I don't know what I'm doing here. I didn't like Bob Cummings."
Oh, jeez.
Well, geez, it was just horror, you know. And there was this long pause, and no one dare look at anyone else. He said, "I loved him. I loved him." And then he spoke such beautiful words. But you know, Burrow, he'd had to get a few laughs before he got going. Bob Cummings, the thing I remember about Bob that was so lovely is when I came out, I didn't know what the front end of the camera was. I still don't really. But the front end, you know, Bob was so kind, so giving, so helpful in every way, and made one feel so accepted. Particularly, you know, you come out from the theater in New York, it's a whole different business. It's strange. And he did away with that. He made you feel part of the whole operation. So he was just beautiful and wonderful to work with. Priscilla Lane was very nice. She was very pleasant. I don't think Hitch was very warm to her. You know, Hitch had favorite leading ladies. He loved Grace Kelly.
Who wouldn't?
Right.
Or who didn't, actually?
I guess she was the number one. But he was shooting Vertigo with Kim Novak, and I went out to visit him on the set, and he had this cold in his nose, and I said, "Oh, Hitch, you have a cold in your nose." And he said, "I have an actress in my nose." So you never knew with the old man how he's quite going to respond. But what prompted that was Priscilla Lane. He was rather neutral about her. Although, this is tales out of school.
Yes.
At some point, the microphone in a scene fell off the pole and hit her on the head, but she had these curls. And Hitch said, "Oh, too bad she had the curls." So that's the nearest I know about her. But he was very strong. Now he loved Ingrid Bergman, and they eventually formed a company together. The picture didn't turn out so well. It was the one made down in Australia, title of which escapes me. But what is interesting, just by happenstance, I happened to be in the very first shot he did with Bergman in Spellbound. Mm-hmm. And he laid out a shot with a crane. And that was the shot. It required her to have some kind of movement eventually to a desk or whatever. She objected to the movement. Now, she was Selznick's big star at the time. And Hitchcock was also under contract to Selznick. Mm-hmm. But she tried to get Hitch to change the whole shot. I mean, by not moving. That means you'd have to get off the crane, all that. He didn't argue. He just, well, this is the shot, he said. That's it. That's it. And that's the way he was. You know, after a while, he didn't go to rushes at all. If there was some problem, they would come to him and say, well, you know, in this scene, thus and so. Then he'd go and look at the piece of film. Mm-hmm. But actually, if the stuff was okay, all he wanted to do was hear about it. He didn't look at it.
He must have trusted his editor.
Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. He had such confidence in what he saw. Mm-hmm. He had amazing eyes. This is extraordinary. You know the lead-ins he used to do for the television show.
Yes.
And again, you know, we didn't have the equipment you have today, which would made it simpler. But in any case, the camera, let's say, would be, with the teleprompter on it, would be 40 feet away for certain shots.
Yes.
And his great trick, and maybe he would dolly in, but his great trick was to look at it and never blink. If you look at them, you'll see he never blinks.
I remember.
He made a game of everything, and that was the game, that he would never blink.
Yes, marvelous. I remember that very well.
It gives an effect.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Absolutely.
No, you don't meet those fellows every day. There was a wonderful director whom we haven't mentioned, maybe you do, Billy, that I was very fortunate to work with, Jean Renoir.
I meant to ask you about that.
And the interesting thing about Renoir is that he was sort of a fish out of water here. He was the most Frenchman you could possibly meet. If you wanted to know what France was in the 30s and early 40s, or in the 20s and the 30s, just look at the Renoir films, of which there are at least two masterpieces, Grand Illusion and Rules of the Game, which they're still trying to catch up with. Chaplin and Wells both said that from their point of view, Renoir was number one. They felt that what he got into his pictures, what it was the humanity. The scripts are literature, the good scripts. He didn't have that much luck in this country. Partly, I think, because maybe of language, and partly he never quite caught the properties or had the writers here with whom he developed scripts in Europe, or the actors, because he had Gabin, he had Michel Simon, he had Pierre Frenet, and he had von Stroheim, and so on. He communicated with them very well. Jean, when he started here, had language problems. They tell the story of, well, Dana Andrews used to tell the story, because the first picture Jean made here was a picture called Swamp Water, with Dana, Walter Huston, and Ann Baxter. It may have been her first picture, I don't know. But he was directing the scene with Dana and Ann Baxter, and he said, he's very good, yeah, but you have to smell a little. So they looked at each other. We'll do it again. They did it again. He says, he's very nice, but you have to smell a little. Well, it was 4 or 5 takes before Dana realized what Jean was saying was smile a little. And this happened with a girl in the Okefenokee swamp when they went on second location. He said, dear little girl, when you get in the bowl, wet a little. Wet a little. And she was horrified. He meant wait a little. But he did have that, but he was so beautiful. He was a great artist. He was a great humanist. France and so forth. And one could go on. As a director, by the way, he was one of the very first. I'm not talking about the old silent films and the shorts and so on, but in talking pictures and pictures on that scale, to use improvisation, not in the method style, but just letting actors improvise. And the Southerner, he let me run up and down, whipping and things, and he just lets you do it. Although, in the Southerner, there was a scene where a cow was supposed to go through a vegetable patch and be chased by a little dog. And every time they'd roll, the cow would start through, and the dog, they'd put the dog in, and the dog would be so frightened of the cow, it'd run out of the shot. Well, they did about 5 takes, and it always ran out of the shot. And finally, the 6 times it ran out, Jean caught it, and he said, act, idiot. But he was a man, he came from a tradition. First of all, his father was Pierre-Auguste Renoir. Secondly, he knew every great figure in France. He had been in World War I. He'd been in the Air Corps, of all things, photographing, and he got shot. And for the rest of his life, he had this not only limp, but a wound that never really healed. And the way he got interested in movies was this: his mother saved his leg because she wouldn't let them amputate it. And so he had to, it was 1918, I think, sit with his leg up. And so he sat in a theater. He had been a ceramicist. And so he sat with his leg up. And there was this new thing called movies. And he watched them. He said, I think I might do that. Now, he started to direct at about 1919, 1920, somewhere in there. And everyone said, oh, Jean Renoir, the son of the great painter. He'll try to imitate his father. And everyone would say, oh, he's just like his father, and so on. He's the son of Pierre-Auguste. He'll get a free ticket. Now, at the end of his life, my wife and I used to go up and visit him almost every Sunday towards the end. And he had started running all his pictures, all of which, there were 50 of them, all of which were on 16mm film. And we go up and sit in his living room, which had some Renoirs around the wall. And what would happen is, if, say, there were 3 Renoirs on that wall, a screen would come down in front of it. And there were 3 over there. And where that cupboard is, they would part, and the lens of the projector would come out. And he'd run the pictures. And so, in the last year and a half of his life, he ran pictures until he could no longer articulate. He began to fade. But one day, he said, When I first started making films, they said what I just said to you. Oh, Jean Renoir. He'll get a free ticket. He'll imitate his father. Get all those looks in from the paintings. So, Jean said, I was determined that under no conditions would I ever, ever, ever imitate my father. I would go out of my way to deliberately get away from my father's influence. And now I've looked at 50 of my pictures, and I realized that what I was doing all my life was trying to imitate my father. It was the most moving moment, you know, not long before he died. He said I was trying to imitate my father. He was a man of such great size, and a lovely story about him because it gives you an insight into the personality. His son, Alain, who is still alive, whom we see, lives up in Northern California, is now in his 80s. But Alain was in the French army in World War II, and they were absolutely defeated by the Germans, and they all scattered. Everybody ran. Alain ran. He was 19 years old, and he got to Morocco, and he was there for a fairly long period of time before his father, who was already here, could get him over to this country. So finally, Alain gets over to America, and they're at dinner one night. And Jean says to his son, I think it would be only polite, since the United States has admitted you to their country, I think it would be only polite for you to enlist in the army. I love the use of the word polite. And he did. And he saw terrifying action in the South Pacific. Really. The only amusing aspect of that is in the middle of all this action, they came up to him one day and he just went in and said, hey, Frenchie, you've just been made a citizen. He said, thanks. Bullets going all around the place. But
That's lovely.
he was a beautiful director in that he had not only the visual sense, but the sense of improvisation and the sense of human relationships. If you think of the pictures and the scripts are literature. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The greatest line he ever wrote is one of the I think the greatest line ever written in pictures. And the line is, unfortunately, everyone has his reasons. That is a line to contemplate.
Oh, Norman, you've had such great experiences. I envy you. Do you have any thoughts that you want to share about St. Elsewhere that would not put me in a bad light?
Lovely, Billy, lovely. Oh God, you was so marvelous. How you were the motor of that show. The thing is, as I indicated right at the top of this session, I used to love that show. I used to say to the young people coming in,
Yes.
treasure it, savor it. Once in a lifetime it happens.
Yes.
Don't kid yourself. You're not going to get this again. The point being that, and Billy will understand this because he's done so much work in the theater. You know, when you do a play, you hope for a long run. But about the second month, as you're about to go on, you say, what the hell am I doing here? I've done this. This is a pain. But I need that check. And out you go.
Yes, exactly.
Now, is that true? Am I right?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Right. So the thing about St. Elsewhere, with that wonderful cast, was that it was like doing a Broadway show, for me certainly, but the script changing every week. So you were fresh every week with the same wonderful cast. I thought that was a gift from heaven. That was, and we had Billy, who gave that show that wonderful sort of mixture of comedy and reality and seriousness all in one. What a character Dr. Craig was. Billy's creation with some very good writing, terrific writing by Tom Fontana and Macias and a couple of others. But Billy took that thing and made it absolutely his own. And then we had Ed Flanders, whom we all miss, a superb actor, just so real, huh? Was it never a dishonest moment, huh?
I've never worked with an actor that I enjoyed doing scenes with, like I did with Ed.
Right,
You know,
right.
maybe just
His loss is enormous because he brought. I tell again, young people come on. I said, watch him. You don't have to go to drama school. Watch what he does. How he talks and listens. The way he would talk and listen.
oh, he was a great listener.
And we had that, and wonderful other people. Ed Begley, who had this marvelous comic sense. Of course, I think the greatest moment in all the 6 years was when Billy and Ed were operating on somebody, and Ed got off one of his stupid remarks, I mean his character, and Billy hit him with his head over this poor body. That was the single greatest moment in 6 years. I love that show. Well, it was, I mean, it was television, but as I said earlier, the theater. Other than doing King Lear, which I was fortunate enough to do with Luke Alhern, but, or I can't, Caesar, I mean Shakespeare, you know, and so forth. But this was superior to any play I ever did, actually. Other than the classics, I never really got a play that was terribly well written, I thought. This was brilliantly written. Wouldn't you say so, Billy?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, all the actors in town would want to come on the show because of the writing. So we had a lot of wonderful guest stars, you know, on this show.
Oh, yeah.
You know, they just wanted to do it. But you're quite right. They have to remember. Do we have some members of the cast were they supposed to
Yeah.
have? There we go. There we
Yes.
go. You know, oh, honey. Hi, sweetheart.
yes, it's she is.
Good seeing you, dear.
Yes.
Yeah.
How about your wife?
Is she here? Oh.
Is she here?
Yes, of course.
Bonnie?
Yeah.
And
Yes.
Barbara Wittery just left. She had to go pick up her daughter.
Oh, okay. Okay.
She sent her love.
Ah.
I'm sorry I didn't introduce them sooner.
In my view, that show, its qualities, was the zenith of television. I can't think of any show that had its qualities, because it not only had the reality, it had a fantastic wit and subject matter. It dealt with stuff that had never been touched before. Am I right?
That's exactly.
The first time age was ever mentioned in a brilliant script, and all those subjects that I won't enumerate them, but the first time, I mean, dialysis, the cost of dialysis, all this was gone into for the first time. The show was, if you'll forgive my unpleasantness, ripped off by several other shows in the course of time. But it never, no show, no medical show ever touched the writing of that show.
Right.
There you go.
And we had a couple of wonderful concepts that were done when the show went back in time.
Yes.
And so forth. Well, we'll go to that. But I look back on it.
No, you know, Norman, you're quite right about, you know, doing theater. And, you know, when you do theater, you have the whole problem of recreating each evening. I've done some plays that have run 2 years, you know, and the whole problem is kind of keep it fresh because it's always the same lines. On a show like St. Elsewhere, it's like your character is ever evolving into something else that you would never have dreamt of, having a son who dies, or this and that and the other thing, so that it's a constant challenge, and it constantly kept you fresh and alert to
Right.
all of that. And the writing, as you say, was the best.
And when I came in and I looked at the script one day and I'm playing Superman.
Yes, yes.
I said, well, do I have to fly? They said, yes. And they rigged out something. They had me flying. My back wasn't
Yes,
the
how
same after
dare
it.
they
but-
do that to you? Oh,
well.
Anyway, does anyone have any further questions? Yes, dear.
I was curious, when you were talking about Walter Matthau, you mentioned candy butcher. And
What, dear?
when you were talking about Walter Matthau before, you mentioned the term candy butcher, which I wasn't sure what that meant.
I said, what?
Candy butcher?
Candy butcher.
Oh,
Oh, you-
it's a guy who went up and down the aisle selling candy in the theater.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, that was, a long time ago.
Now I know what you call them.
Yeah. Walter.
Yes.
Did-
When they ran Chaplin out of the country, did you have an opportunity to speak with him following that, perhaps when he was brought back in triumph, discuss that whole episode with him?
I didn't get the question.
When he was run out of the country,
Yes.
did you have an opportunity to speak to him afterwards?
Oh, yes. Yes, because it so happened that we owned a property together. We owned it for 16 years, and the reason we never made it is he said he'd never make another picture in this country. And so I had to sell it, and they shoot horses, don't they? Which he knew a lot about. He used to go to those dance marathons. And the idea was that Charlie was going to write it and produce it, and he wanted me to direct it, and it was for his son Sidney to play
Sidney Chaplin,
Sidney
yeah.
Chaplin, his son, to play the lead. And Sidney and Charlie Jr. Knew a girl at that time who would be perfect for the part. We never got around to even interviewing her because this whole thing blew up. And the girl was Marilyn Monroe, who would have been perfect for the part. In my view, the picture never was right. It was because Jane Fonda, a very lovely actress, but her breeding was too fine for this poor thing in that story. So I did see him. I went to Switzerland and stayed with him in this place for a few days, trying to talk about how we could find a way of doing this. You had to do it here. And so I saw him then. But in Switzerland, he had aged considerably. I think it was the lack of working every day at a script. He once said, "I don't deserve my dinner unless I do a certain amount of work each day." That's a quote. And that work would take the form of his writing, or if the writing wasn't going well, he'd go to his piano and work out some music, the tunes of which you know, one of which is an eternal hit, Smiles. And so he felt he had aged in Switzerland.
Was he bitter? Was he bitter about?
I'm trying to think if he ever referred. He never referred to it.
No.
When I was in Switzerland, he never referred to it. It's just that he was not interested. At that time, he was interested just in his autobiography, which came out shortly after I visited him in the early 60s. But once he got to Switzerland, it was over. He did do, 2 pictures in Europe. He did The King in New York, which is not good. And then he did the thing with Sophia Loren and Marlon Brando and Sydney.
Countess of Hong Kong?
Count for Hong Kong. Now, he originally had written that for himself and Paulette Goddard to do in the early 40s. but they never got around to doing it. And so at this time, when he saw an opportunity to make a deal with Universal, and then Brando would come on board, and Loren would come on board, etc., he did it. But you know, I watched him on the set when they were doing Countess from Hong Kong, because I was visiting London at that time, and it was all gone. It wasn't Charlie that I knew. He was a firebrand. He was a fire eater. He was, you know, like he was like a fanatic when he worked. But now it was an old man, and he just didn't have that fire in the belly that you need.
Living with the Swiss will do that.
What, dear?
Living with the Swiss will do that.
Yes.
Living with the Swiss. Yes, dear.
Well, considering that you've seen everything and done everything, but apart from an old man, what is your next project?
What did she say?
Considering that you've done everything,
Oh, yes.
she was wondering what your next project would be.
Well, I just did a film with Cameron Diaz.
Oh, my God.
Well, we leading men never give up. Yeah, this is the film in which I play a blind 90-year-old professor of literature. And
Oh, is that the one you got made up for?
yeah, oh yeah. I had to put on the whole thing. And so that's now in the cutting stage. They're cutting, so that's the next project.
Did you have a question? Okay.
From someone who's been to a lot of these seminars, I think I'm not the only one here who would agree that by your spirit, you are the youngest guest we've ever had.
I have a tennis match tomorrow morning, and I'm going to bring that on the court.
What I wanted to ask you about is if you could say a little bit about your own acting technique. When you get a script, a fresh script, how do you break it down? How do you decide what you're going to do?
I'm being exposed.
I know. Yes.
I tell you, I really don't think I have any system at all. I think, now that you pose the question to me, I think I almost have a literary or intellectual approach to a script. I think of the script as a whole. Maybe it's because I've directed and produced and all that, and you always are involved in that aspect of it. But I read the whole thing, and if I want to act in it, I think of it more from a quality of the script thing. Now, just to elaborate on that a little bit, when I started with Le Gallien in 1932, Broadway was the thing. The Broadway professional actor, Lee Tracy, Lloyd Nolan, those guys, they were terrific, you know, and they had Kaufman directing, they had pace, and you picked up your cues, you moved the thing, and so forth. You had to learn how to move, or hope you would move properly, and all the graces that, because as Chaplin once said, an audience comes to a theater to find something they don't have in their own lives. And one of the things was charm and energy, or two of the things. And so you would try to supply that. And Broadway had that. Now, it's very interesting that today you do not have in the theater, and I don't think you have it in pictures either, great leading ladies. In those days, there was Catherine, and we could list the picture people too, but in the theater there was Catherine Cornell, Helen Hayes, Pauline Lord, Ina Clare, Tallulah Bankhead. You could just, Lynn Fontanne, you could just go on and on. And the actors, Alfred Lunt, breathtaking, perhaps the greatest actor we've ever had, and so on. But, and in pictures, Garbo, Crawford, Betty Davis, you could go on and on with the list. I don't think we have that now. something has changed. Maybe everything's too real. I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. But what I was reaching for is that when I started, there was no such thing as the method. I mean, we did know about it. Stanislavski had already been doing it. Now, in that period, in the 30s, the group theater emerged. And in my view, to this day, remains the finest acting company we have ever had. When they really were working together, it was something to see. The method radiated out from that company. And so it became a thing, particularly of acting schools, because there was a lot of rationalism to it. And there was a lot of fake psychology to it that wasn't Stanislavski's. It was other people's who added to it. And as a result of all that, it became a thing. And it became identified with realism. And as Dorenmont said, things changed for the worse when some actor couldn't remember his lines, and thus came reality. You know what I'm getting. So there was that enormous influence on the theater, because all that theater that was coming out of Guthrie McClintock and Cornell and those people was rejected, and all the young people were coming into the method, in which name many sins were committed. Then, so you asked, I went through all that. I actually did a play with the group theater. But eventually you come out with your own way, whatever it is, I think. I mean, it's for each actor to say it, I think. Because there were too many people laying down the law in those days. Strasberg, Meisner, Bobby Lewis, everybody laying down the law, what you do. Stella Adler, whom I adored.
Yeah.
What I like about Stella Adler is when she was walking along Broadway one day and an actor came up and said, "Hello, Stella, what's new?" She said, "You don't say new, you say new." "Oh," he said, "so when do you say new?" She said, "You say new when you want to know what's new."
You know, there was a young lady who asked your question to Arthur Treacher about his acting, and he said, "My dear, I say the lines, take the check and piss off."
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. But you're right. You know, when Spencer Tracy was asked his definition of acting,
No, what?
he said, "Hit the marks."
Yes. Yes.
And Jimmy Cagney was asked his definition of acting. He said, "Stand on the balls of your feet and tell the truth." Someone has a question.
Yes.
I have to agree with you with your statement about the great actors of the time compared to the actors now. Do you think the lack of a studio system has something to do with that, the lack of quality we have now?
You mean the old studio system?
Yes.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I don't think it has to do with the question of great acting. It may have to do with the quality of the movies. One has to think that through. I happen to like the old studio system. There was some kind of stability, and every once in a while a real picture would come out. It was great for the actors. They had wonderful actors. You know, I was under contract to Metro in the 40s. They had over 300 actors under contract, starting with Gable and Tracy, who had in the commissary their own table, which had a chocolate game on it. And there was the writer's table and the producer's table and the actor's table. And we used to sit at the actor's table, Mickey Rooney and Mitchum and Robert Walker, if you remember him. We'd sit there and dare any one of us to go over and sit at the chocolate table. And who had the guts to go and sit there? No one. But the studio system cultivated great stars. You see, one of the things that the studio system did do, they would write for the stars. And let's say a script would come in for Gable and a leading lady. And I know Metro had a writer named Marguerite Roberts, who was a wonderful writer. And if a script came in and had a lot of qualities but lacked the romantic scenes that it needed for this leading couple, she would put those into the script. Or there was a writer named Sonia Levine who would write for Garbo, come in and supply scenes that those actors would show well in, you see. But that is the only thing I could think of that they would add to. Today, the other thing was, you see, today you have committees. You come to the thing I really object to terribly is the monitor. That is to say, you actors, you do a scene. It used to be the director, Hitchcock, would sit in this chair, the camera was right here, and he'd sit and watch you. And you, as an actor, had a sense that he was your audience. And boy, what an audience. And that went for any of the good directors. Nowadays, there's no director there, there's nobody. In the other room is a monitor, and watching this monitor is a committee. The director, the script girl, who have to be there, the cameraman, he has to be there. But then you start with the producer, the co-producer, the co-producer, the co-producer, the co-producer, and the co-producer, and the writer. I have, without mentioning shows, done one where there were 8 people watching the monitor. Now, when the take is over, there's a vote. Right, Billy?
Yes.
It's a vote.
Yes.
Now, it used to be there was one person, let's say Hitchcock, or Renoir, or Chaplin, or whoever. Yeah. As Hitch used to say, cut it, that's all you need. Let's go over here. You don't have that anymore. You have this breaking down. You can't do it. Picture should be a vision of somebody, even a television show. Because look at the television shows. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think the studio system, I think the other system was better. Makes me sound old-fashioned, but that's it.
I agree.
That's it. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Quick question. Going back to Chaplin, what did you think of the Attenborough Robert Downey movie, Chaplin?
Terrible.
Did you?
Yeah. I thought Downey was very good, though. I thought he was very good indeed. Picture was terrible, and in one respect, in regard to Charlie and his romantic liaisons, it never touched Charlie and the women in his life at all, particularly Una, which is the woman he really, really loved. She was remarkable. She had her own genius and of great beauty. But I always loved Charlie about her father, Eugene O'Neill. He said to me one day, you know, he's not a very good writer. I like that. Yeah, the old man, he really.
Yes, sir.
What memories do you have that really stick out in terms of working on the radio?
On the radio?
Yeah.
Well, I did some radio. I was never one of the guys who really, you know the old story about those guys who used to do so many shows. Someone said, how you doing? And he said, terrific, but it'll pick up. Because some of these guys would go from, did you, Billy?
Oh, no.
CBS to NBC, which were not far from each other.
That's right.
And they'd have stand-ins to rehearse for them. They had so much work. Some guy would do it and then hand him the cut script and the marked script and so forth. And the guy would come in, just read it cold. But
I heard some of them had, at one point, an ambulance to take them from one place to another because they could just, go through the traffic and get there in time to do what they were.
That was Orson.
Was it?
Orson did that.
There you go.
But curiously, I never did any of the radio with Orson. I did a recording of The Merchant of Venice with him, but I never did any radio. He had his own group. You see, he had the theater company, that was one thing. Then he had the radio company, that was another. Then when he came out here, he united the two companies and brought them out here. But then eventually it all sifted out, and he stayed pretty much with the radio company, I think. Agnes Moorehead and Paul Stewart, I think Everett Sloan, one or two others from the, Ray Collins, huh?
No, George Coulouris.
Who?
Coulouris?
George.
And Coulouris was the one guy who leaped over from one to the other. He was in the theater company and he was in the radio thing. Yes.
Joseph Cotton?
Well, Joe, yes, Joe worked with him in radio and of course in the theater. But at the time that we came out here to do The Heart of Darkness, and he brought the radio company, and Joe was in Philadelphia Story. He was in the original production. He and Van Heflin were the two guys that were played in the movie by Grant and Stewart. So he couldn't come out. But yes, Joe always, they did radio in the old days. Joe Cotton is the man responsible for announcing a show one week. Joe Cotton was the most wonderful guy. He was the most elegant guy. David O. Selznick, to whom he was under contract, because Joe used to dress in the scarves and the flannels and the thing and the wing, and he'd refer to him as Richard Harding Davis, who was like Tom Wolfe, the writer, was back in the turn of the century. But Joe had wonderful humor, but two things he did. He was beautiful. He was announcing the next week's show, and he said, and next week our star is Sonny Tufts. It's a famous line.
Yes,
He's the guy who did it. Joe is the guy.
Oh my God! I knew the story. I
And
didn't know
the
it was
other
that.
story is that Selznick made a picture called Since You Went Away during World War II. And it was for the war effort. And Joe was asked to say something on the air, and they didn't give him a script. They said, could you just say something about the picture? So he said, since you went away is the longest picture I have seen this year. He was beautiful.
Oh God!
So, but we got off. I don't know if I answered your question about that thing, but the thing was.
Yes. Well, I think this has been a wonderful evening. I don't know. Have you enjoyed it?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Billy.
Thank you, sir.
Lovely. Lovely.